Well, we're just going to give everybody another couple minutes here to file in, and then we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm just going to give a quick little intro on what this is, and then we can get started. But yeah, basically, we want to bring back these AMAs. We started doing these back in 2020, and I think it's an interesting hybrid between, a workshop, but also, a chance to kind of ask questions to somebody who's a little bit further on in their builder journey. So, we'll be doing these over the month of HackFS with entrepreneurs, builders, investors, accelerators, just kind of get a sense of what's next for people building over the next few weeks, and kind of what the journey looks like from there. So yeah, wanted to invite up Elena from our side. Elena is the founder and CEO of Ironfish, which is an awesome privacy preserving protocol. Welcome to the stage. And yeah, these are going to be pre-recorded, or recorded. So, anybody watching this later has any questions, feel free to drop them in any of the HackFS channels, and we'll do our best to address them as well. And of course, for anybody that's tuning in live, we're going to save some time for questions at the end. This is meant to be an AMA. So if you have some questions at the end, we'll save some time. So yeah, anyway, welcome. Thanks for doing this. Really excited to chat.
Thank you. Yeah, me too.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I think maybe a good place to start would be just to kind of learn a little bit more about what initially led you to crypto. I know you've been in the space for a long time. And I guess how did you originally, even really hear about this thing or interact with it the first time? And how did you initially join the community?
Yeah, so I was asking whether or not, Filecoin or Vertical Labs or kind of adjacent technologies were part of this hackathon, primarily because that was actually my start too. So in 2017, I went to a dinner at the Vertical Labs house. So they used to have a house where they both like worked and lived in at the same time. Maybe it was actually 2016, 2017, like that era. And it was, a pretty big dinner and a bunch of people were there. And that was the first time that I even heard about Ethereum, because everybody at that dinner was talking about Ethereum. And just to kind of like set, context, Ethereum just hit like $30 and people were like super excited. They're like, oh my God, this is a thing. And I remember driving back from that dinner and like Googling, like, what is Ethereum? And so that was basically my starting point. After that, the very first ETHGlobal hackathon was announced, ETH Waterloo. And I decided to go. And that was a pretty special moment. I remember pretty much like everyone who was early in crypto was there. Like the maker team was there, Live Peer, like Vitalik was there, his dad was there, like everyone, it felt like a really, really inclusive community. And then Dan Finlay, who was, I think the only core engineer for MetaMask at the time. Like
So.
he was there as well, and he was actually helping me debug my hackathon project like 3 a.m. And so that was like my starting point of crypto of like, wow, like this is an amazing community, and I want to be a part of it. So yeah, that was my start.
So cool. Yeah, that first hackathon was really special. I remember Dan met up with the Brave team at that event too, and they shipped the Brave Firefox integration that
That's
weekend
right.
as
Yeah,
well. So it was both like a productive time for people who were coming as partners or sponsors at the time, and also anybody just there. It was super collaborative. So that was a fun weekend. Do you remember what you built that weekend?
yeah. So at the time I only knew about IPFS because I went to that dinner. And literally at the hackathon, like as Vitalik was giving his like keynote speech, I was Googling like Solidity tutorials. And
Nice.
so I kind of knew those two things, IPFS and like a tiny bit of Solidity. And so I built a decentralized file streaming service, or sorry, video streaming service. So the idea is that you would take a large video file, you would transcode it into multiple chunks, put that on IPFS, and then have like decentralized video streaming using IPFS. So that's what I built. And then I built like a maker component to it so I could qualify for some of the side prizes, which worked out great.
Nice. It's good to know that even back in 2017, people were finding ways to include random technology into their projects to claim for bounties.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if there's any hackathon strategy that has worked really well for me, of like just making sure you understand some of the requirements and kind of going after those. So that's like a general advice actually for any hackathon goers.
Totally. I also remember that back at that hackathon, although they did not work on it, Yondon was there from the live peer team, and they were also working on that kind of same problem too. So it's been cool
Totally.
to see
And
what
that's
they've been
actually
able to do.
like when I where I met them. Because I was like,
Sweet.
oh, like this is a cool project. And someone was like, oh, like there's literally a legit team building this. You
They're
should
right
look at
there.
them. They're like right there. And I'm like amazing. So yeah.
Well, super cool. Well, yeah, I guess from those kind of humble beginnings of Googling Solidity 101 during
Yeah.
the keynote of ETH Waterloo, I guess kind of curious what led you kind of down the kind of road to privacy as the focus on where you'd be spending most of your time.
Yeah. So ironically, it is actually from that first project. So when I built my video streaming kind of tool, the core transcoding part of the video, and transcoding is like a fancy word for like, translating a video from one format to another. That was still done on a AWS machine. And so to me, it was kind of this disconnect of like, well, Ethereum's trying to be like the decentralized compute layer, but clearly you can't put something like video transcoding on Ethereum smart contract. That doesn't make sense. And so then I started thinking about this problem of like, well, how would you do decentralized compute? Like, how would you do a decentralized network of servers completing like really complicated computational tasks and being rewarded for that? So I went down that rabbit hole. And I got to meet teams like TrueBit, if you remember them from the 2017
totally.
era.
Early
They were
L2s.
working on that. Which is a precursor to what we have now in terms of like fraud proofs, which is kind of a weird, like a crazy history, background lesson there. And then I was talking to various people in the space, and until someone actually pointed me to Charlie Noyes, who was at the time at I think Pantera. I think he's now at Paradigm, and or adjacent to. I don't want to misspeak his resume. But he was pretty obsessed about this problem at the time too, and he actually gave me the first Pinocchio paper. So Pinocchio paper is like it was published in 2013 by Microsoft Research and IBM Research, and that was actually the foundational kind of paper that led to Zcash as we now know today. Effectively, this is like a lot of like paraphrase of like a lot of really complicated ZKB history. And I read that paper, and the paper itself is not very long. It's like maybe like 10 pages, give or take. And I remember thinking like, wow, like I don't understand any of this. Like I understand the individual words, but when I read this,
why are they together?
This is so complicated. Like I'm missing so much context here.
Totally.
And so that like led me to this like journey of like understanding how zero knowledge proofs worked. And especially at the time, it was very tribal knowledge. Like it's like you kind of went from the Wikipedia page example of like Alice and Bob running through some caves as a demonstration of what zero knowledge proofs are. And then you went from that level all the way down to like the Edwards twist or whatever has these properties. And you're like, whoa, like, is there any like middle ground? And at the time, the answer was no. And so that kind of led me to the journey of like literally just going to the people directly. And so I went to some of the Zcash founding scientists or like the people that worked on the protocol at the time, and just started asking them questions directly of like, how does this work? How do I get to know more about it? And I think like one really special property of crypto or like the crypto community is that like a lot of people are extremely open about it, right? So I think like if you just ask the person, hey, like I tried reading the Zcash white paper and I have all these questions, they were extremely willing to kind of sit down with me and dedicate, their time and explain how the protocol worked. which I was extremely grateful for. And so like that kind of journey led into that direction. And I remember like, reading back in the day, like recursive ZK snarks, or the paper on recursive snarks in general, which was co-authored by Alessandro Chiesa, one of the Zcash founding scientists. And he is, or at least was at the time, a professor at Berkeley, and I think still is. And I was able to just go to his like office hours and be like, hey,
Nice.
can I actually use recursive snarks to build a blockchain that would like kind of verify its own state? So I kind of like came up with was thinking about the idea of Mina before I even knew that Mina was like a thing.
Right.
And he kind of like walked me through it, and he was like, this is not possible for like these reasons, or at least not the way that I was thinking about it. But I was like so just appreciative and grateful of the time that was given to me. And so I think like to kind of answer your question, sorry, I went a bit of a rant. Like I kind of realized that even if crypto was to go away, like zero knowledge proofs were here to stay in one way or another. And I wanted to be involved in that. And when I kind of surveyed this space of like, what is the most impactful thing that I could work in crypto that also intersected with zero knowledge proofs, privacy was by far the most obvious answer. Like at the time, and even now, very, very few teams were working on privacy. And I thought like that is just such a huge important issue for crypto, because if we're going to be building this kind of unbiased borderless payment system that represents, like freedom and like personal rights, how can we do that without privacy? So that's kind of what led me down that path.
Amazing. I think that's super cool. I think it teases out a couple other like kind of smaller questions I have as well. Like, especially for a lot of the people kind of in this call or watching later, like, they'll find themselves needing to get in touch, or it would be highly beneficial for them to like find that person. And, maybe they can't just go to Berkeley for office hours, although that's a pretty good hack, I think.
Yeah.
I guess like, what's your advice for, reaching out to people who, may have, academic or career advantage over yourself, and just sort of like reaching out to them and trying to get some help from that type of individual?
Yeah, I think I would just ask around. So for instance, zero knowledge proof community is still fairly small. Like even though it's been, several years, and like the space definitely has exploded in popularity, and also there's a ton more people involved who I would deem to be experts. Like I think the number of experts in the space has definitely like ballooned. But it's still a very small community, and so I think like if you are interested in something extremely niche, for instance, I would just honestly cold reach out to projects and be like, hey, like I'm interested in this topic. I want to contribute, or I want to think about this with you. Where can I go from here? And for zero knowledge proofs, like there's like a ton of like Telegram channels that are like very dedicated to talking about zero knowledge proofs. Or even like for our Discord channel, like if you wanted to, have a conversation, like we have just a general questions channel. And I think we used to have a ZKP channel where people can like have a conversation that's specific to that topic. And you would just be surprised like how many people you find on the internet who are obsessed about the same thing that you are.
Totally.
And if you just poke through our communities, either you will find that group of people, or people will naturally redirect you to that.
Totally. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. Yeah, kind of zooming in maybe to that journey. You hear about Ethereum at a dinner, you join a hackathon, which is great publicity for what we do.
Of course.
You get super excited about the Pinocchio paper and ZK proofs and this stuff, and you start kind of reaching out and becoming part of that community. Is it a straight line from that moment to Ironfish as it is today, or were there kind of ups and downs or different ideas that didn't work out? What was that kind of progression in the early days like?
Yeah, so in some ways we're pretty consistent, in other ways we were not. So I think we were very consistent in trying to focus on privacy within crypto, but our approach to that was like not exactly linear, which I think is pretty typical of startups. So like we started the company like late 2018 officially, like the formation docs or whatever, like late 2018.
Yep.
But at the time it was like myself and a friend of mine, and we knew nothing about zero knowledge proofs. We just knew that like from the aspect of privacy, like zero knowledge proofs were going to be like the main narrative. because at the time that actually wasn't clear. Like, I don't know if you remember, like there was Grin, which was a fairly new project coming
Yep.
out, that they were not using so much proofs, and they were extremely popular in the privacy space. And
Hmm.
so like I think like probably like 9 months to a year, I would say, was just pure research, understanding the space better, going to a lot of hackathons and conferences for better or worse,
Yeah.
which is always um and kind of like really refining the idea. And then we raised our seed round basically in 2020, like literally December, January 2020, where we were kind of like refining more of what that means. And I think our first thesis was, well, if we build a better privacy blockchain, then like users will come. And then very quickly we kind
Mm.
of realized that the Ethereum ecosystem and these other ecosystems were flourishing in their own ways. And if we were to build a very isolated blockchain that solved a problem that we, really cared about, we were kind of missing out on all this innovation that was happening in other kind of like crypto ecosystems. So then we raised our Series A in 2021 with this thesis of like, well, actually, what we're building is a privacy layer for all chains. And that's
Mm.
exactly how Ironfish is today. So we launched in April 20th, 2023 last year. And we're the only privacy chain that actually supports custom assets, or at least a privacy chain that is also launched that
Sure.
supports custom assets. So a user can create their own custom assets that are completely private. So a transaction involving a custom asset versus a native asset would be indistinguishable. And we built that primarily so we could partner with bridge operators or bridge networks and connect Ironfish to as many chains as possible, so we could provide privacy to every other crypto asset. So right now, that's literally what we're doing. We have a partnership with Chainport, and we just announced our partnership with Axelar. And
Hmm.
we hopefully by the end of the year with those two partnerships, we'll be connected to over 65 chains, supporting various assets from those chains, and getting to like a safe, compliant private USDC, private USDT, private ETH, experience for users. But yeah, I mean, like we
Cool.
started the company technically in 2018 and it's 2024. So this is definitely
Yeah.
a non-linear journey in a lot of ways.
And I think also like it's interesting to note that yeah, you started end of 2018, and then you actually didn't raise the seed until end of 2020, you said, right? So you actually had a long kind of time of exploration and just sort of like figuring things out, which I think is worth highlighting, mostly because I feel like when I talk to a lot of like early, hackathon participants or founders, like they're always like in a very big hurry. Like it's like we have to do this, we have to do that, we have to do this, and then we like can do X, Y, Z. And it's like it seems like actually like especially if you're solving a hard problem like you are, being able to take that time and being able to like focus on the research and making sure the direction is right is is I think worth double clicking on from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, like it felt like we were in a hurry, but we weren't really
Yeah,
building the thing.
sure,
So I think like all work is useful work, even though sometimes it's going to be throwaway work.
totally, totally. Yeah, not to say you didn't work for like 2 years. You were obviously working very, very
No,
hard.
no.
Um, cool. I guess just kind of wrapping up the kind of beginning stages, looking back on that period, a lot of the people on this call or watching this later are going to be kind of starting this for the first time. I guess what is your advice to kind of early stage founders and people who are kind of joining this startup journey or starting their own thing for the first time? What's some of the kind of early advice you have?
I mean, I think the advice just really varies based on the product that you're building. Because I think in Silicon Valley, for instance, there's this mantra of like ship fast, break things. But we know in crypto, if you do that, then you hurt users and you kind of kill your
Hmm.
project. Um,
Yep.
but there's like some semblance of that. Like, I think like what I see in crypto is like sometimes people overbuild things and it takes them a very long time to build something, and by the time they get to the user, like the crypto industry has changed, and that's pretty unfortunate as well because you don't get that user feedback. So I think it really depends on the product you're building. If it's something that's like super user facing and you can kind of do like the math of like, okay, if I introduce a super bad bug, like people are not going to lose their funds, like that should be
Mhm.
your baseline, then you should ship really fast. And if it's like, okay, if I ship something really fast and people do lose funds, then like don't ship it really fast. Like make sure it's really, I mean, you can still ship fast, but like make sure it's very well tested. So I don't don't
move
know.
fast and break things with stable infra, right? I think that was the adapted line,
Yeah.
right? Got it. Very cool. I guess kind of moving forward to today, and then I'll open it up if anybody has any questions after this. If anybody's curious about kind of more of the like exact problem set that Ironfish is working on, Elena did a great talk on the Pragma Denver stage earlier this year in February, that you can look up on our YouTube channel. I think one of the things that stuck out to me when you were giving that talk was that today it's basically impossible to take 100 USDC. You'd mentioned custom assets rather than just native tokens. So like USDC being a good version of a custom asset stablecoin from one wallet address, pay that privately to another wallet address in today's current technological setup. You'd mentioned at the end of the talk that the kind of timeline for that being doable on Ironfish was kind of in the 3-4 months range. How close are we? Are we almost there?
Yeah. So right now we have 2 partnerships going with Chainport and XLR. And I don't want to speak too much of the timelines because I don't want to overcommit them to something, but I know that like I know that Chainport, for instance, is like working really hard on this. And they're actually pretty close. Like they've pretty much done the most important integrations on their testnet environment that we're currently testing right now. And like right now we're making sure that the wallet integrations are really solid because we want to make sure this is a great experience for users. But yeah, that is actually generally pretty close. So like our goal internally is to enable this by end of year, like for sure, like on mainnet.
Yep.
Which I know sounds like mainnet, like end of year is like that's such a long time from now. But if you think about like testing period, wallet period, if we need to hard fork, like that takes it like at least a month, right? So it's like there's a lot of steps involved. And so I'm pretty confident that we'll get there by end of year. At least with one of our bridge partners, if not both. Right now, both of them are actually on track on this for this timeline, but engineering timelines are are kind of a beast to work with, so I don't want to overpromise.
Estimation, very, very hard.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, awesome. Well, I mean, that's great to hear. I mean, if anybody's curious on why the bridge partners play such a critical role, I think Elena's talk from Denver offers a really great explanation for why it's such a critical role in the infrastructure. So I'll encourage you to go watch that talk. It's a quick one. It's only about 20 minutes long. Okay, we've got some questions in the chat. And then as I mentioned in the text as well, if you'd like to ask your question directly, feel free to do so. You can just kind of share your screen or share your video and we can unmute and you can ask it directly. But yeah, the question from Roger Wall says, so how do you see privacy preserved transactions happening in the context of DEXs? One approach is maybe differential privacy by streaming token transfers instead of one-off transactions, but I'd like to hear more of your views. Yeah,
it's a great question. This is actually something that we've thought about for a long time. About like, and this kind of goes into like maybe a broader question, like what is like private DeFi or privacy preserving DeFi? What is like smart contracts and privacy preserving like protocols even mean? Because they do actually have various definitions, and so DEXs were definitely one part of it. And so I know, for instance, one definition of what a private DEX is that an order does not influence the order book or does not move the order book. What I mean by that is if you have an order like that's very large, for instance, coming in, how do you make sure that it doesn't move the price, for instance, just by a user placing an order? And that is actually a very, very hard problem. There are several teams that I know that are actually working on private DEXs. I could be wrong, but I think that's a really, really hard problem to actually get right because you sacrifice so much on speed and usability and convenience that even if technically you can achieve a fully private DEX, I'm not sure if it'll be like useful, at least not in a decentralized way. I think obviously we can do a privacy like centralized DEX where you just like hide everything, but that's not quite what this person is asking. So for us, like what we're thinking of is how do you hide the identity of the person placing the order, but not the order itself? Because then you get all the benefits of what we see with DEXs or AMMs without like actually moving the order book that much. So what I mean by that is, let's say like you're a whale and you're trying to sell an NFT and or like sell a particular asset, and that the action of you doing that will trigger a bunch of bots either copying or reacting to your transaction. So how do we prevent that from happening? And so for us, like we like either through bridging or through potentially even building something native on Ironfish, like a DEX, what we're trying to build is every time you place an order, it is unlinked, or like that transaction is not linked from your official account, so that you don't move the order book just by placing an order. So that's like our definition of what a private DEX is. That's kind of how we're thinking about it, because then you get a lot of the benefits and the convenience factor and the speed factor of how we're doing AMMs and DEXs today, while still giving users some preservation of privacy. And in that regard, like we still have enough information to, like, for instance, make sure that no sanctioned addresses like interact with the system as well.
Sorry, I was muted. Got it. Very cool.
Hopefully that answered it.
I thought it was a solid answer. Made sense to me.
Yeah, that was really great insights from you.
There you go. Great. Awesome. Cool. There's also a question from Dennis, who said that kind of the early versions of Ironfish were written in JavaScript, I think TypeScript, and then completely rewritten on Rust. Is this correct? And if so, like, what would you recommend to early stage startup owners to bypass such errors? I think in that case, sort of, how do you get ahead of tech debt in that way, I guess?
Yeah, so ironically, we actually did the opposite.
This
is actually a great question. We started Ironfish completely in Rust. And at the time, it was actually called Beanstalk, not to be confused with Beanstalk, the protocol that failed. It's part of the reason why we rebranded. But yeah, no, we started with Rust because we looked at open source libraries and we wanted to use some of the zero knowledge proof open source libraries, and those were written in Rust. And Rust obviously is like a really safe language to use. And so we started with Rust. I think that was actually a really big mistake because we moved so slowly in comparison to if we had chosen like Python or JavaScript. And I know it's like really controversial to say like, oh, I wish we had written our, blockchain in Python or whatever, but, but like, and this is actually part of the reason why we wrote everything in TypeScript, which is obviously a derivation of JavaScript. Like, Rust for us, like if you wanted to get to a prototype, they can actually demo your idea and get users to use it. Rust just took 3 times, if not 10x times longer to do various things. Like one example is we wanted to build peer-to-peer layer based on WebSockets, because that's much better user experience than like opening up your firewall, for instance. And like at the time there was like a wrapped C++ Rust open source library implementation that like we couldn't get to work. And we're like, oh my gosh, like every single step of the way, we have to either rebuild the tool, debugging was much harder, just like your development cycle was so much harder, like compiling it was harder, like the testing infrastructure was like not quite there. And so like that took us a lot longer. And then when we looked at like, well, what are we building? Like, what are the bottlenecks of a blockchain? And a lot of the bottlenecks of a blockchain is IO. So like just interacting with storage, as well as bandwidth. So like how fast is your internet connection to other peers? And obviously there's like a lot more that goes into a full node that Rust actually does help quite a lot with. But one of the projects that we looked at as inspiration was actually this thing called Bcoin. And Bcoin is a JavaScript implementation of the Bitcoin client. And when it was still supported, I don't think it's supported at all anymore, like in 2019, I think James Lopp, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, did a bunch of like benchmarks. And Bcoin came as the second fastest Bitcoin client for syncing, even though like it beat out like C# and like a bunch of other, I think even a Rust implementation of Bitcoin at the time, like actually beat out a bunch of these other clients because they did so many like really clever tricks with how they did IO and bandwidth. And so we looked at that as inspiration and we're like, oh, we can actually choose a language that we can move really fast in, that we can use like, advanced testing frameworks with. And if we like take these learnings from other open source projects, we can make it we'll never make it as fast as Rust, but we'll make it very close to like a full Rust implementation. And so right now Ironfish is like 90% TypeScript, 10% Rust. And so the 10% Rust is like the heavy duty cryptography. And hopefully one day the big kind of like project that we sometimes think about is how to move the workers, for instance, into the Rust side, because right now it's like we have got two worker pools, one in TypeScript, one in Rust, and it'd be great if we can move more things into Rust that are like heavy duty. But yeah, like we were able to move so much faster and iterate so much faster. And that was great. And I think like my personal happiness went up so much when we moved away from Rust. So
yeah, I feel like it's narrative violation, like TypeScript, or go from Rust to TypeScript, not the other way around. But I think
I know.
I think it's an important like consideration, like what are you most familiar with building in, and like what can you move with quickly? And then also, I think like you said, I think the Bitcoin is a good example. Like the Bitcoin client was a good example. Is like, first of all, like great engineering in any language can have great results. And then second of all, not just doing whatever the status quo leading most exciting thing is, actually having to think about what's sort of around. So very cool. Okay, I want to be respectful of your time, so I'll wrap up with my last question, and then we can kind of wrap it up from here, which is just what are you excited about hackers building? You've been a hacker yourself. If you were at this hackathon, what would you be thinking about exploring? What spaces would you be building in?
Okay. Well, one thing that I've been actually really thinking about, which I don't know if it's a good hackathon project, but personally what's been on my mind, and it's gonna sound crazy going from my background, which is like Ironfish is a very decentralized proof of work, privacy preserving protocol that's attempting to build a privacy layer for all assets. So coming from that context, this is going to sound very strange. but
I'm excited now.
But one thing that I was thinking of is like, I think the next narrative, or like one of the narratives for the next bull cycle, is going to be how do we introduce non-crypto institutions to enter the crypto space? So it's like the BlackRocks, the JP Morgans, the gaming studios of the world. And what I think they care about is they definitely care about speed above all else. They care about transaction fees, and they don't necessarily care about decentralization. They do actually care about privacy quite a lot, or at least in some aspects, at least like the financial institutions of the world for sure. So one idea that I've been like pretty obsessed about is like, how would you build a highly parallelizable L2 that uses like Kafka, like like very non-crypto technologies.
Nice.
like a Kafka-esque, high throughput tech stack that is very centralized. It's privacy preserving just because you don't expose the public state to the world. Like there's no other reason. And then you can very easily scale to however, whatever throughput you want. Like before Ironfish, I actually worked at Airbnb as a software engineer. And our homepage after caching, so like caching would take like 90% of the traffic. So after caching, we still had to support up to 20K QPS, like 20,000 queries per second on the homepage. Wow. And like we just, like you use very like vanilla non-crypto standard technologies of like queuing and message passing. And so like one idea that I was kind of toying with is like someone should build that for Ethereum, or like actually I think Ethereum, like the EVM is pretty dominant regardless of what you see in other systems, and just build like a really high throughput L2 that doesn't care about decentralization, which I know is like very controversial, but I think would actually
be interesting. Very cool. Oh, very cool. I like that. Yeah, I remember somebody at one point built at one of our events a blockchain using Google Sheets.
Nice.
So the back end was just a Google Sheet.
That's not going to get you the throughput, but
it got a surprisingly high amount of throughput. Actually, it was pretty good.
Oh, really?
But
all right.
Yeah, because it just used Google's APIs, so it worked pretty well.
All right, good job, Google.
Exactly. Well, cool, awesome. Well, wanted to thank you for taking the time out of your day to come and chat with us, and thanks everybody for your questions and for joining us today. And we'll still have 3 more on the schedule for the rest of the event, so feel free to come out. And in the meantime, thank you so much, Elena. Right. Really appreciate your time, and wishing you all the best with Ironfish and making that USDC transfer private.
Amazing. Thank you so much. All right. Good luck, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.